Ronan Castellano thought the deal falling through early was just a stroke of bad luck. He had no idea it was the hand of fate pushing him home 3 hours sooner than planned, just in time to witness the one thing the most powerful man in Chicago was never meant to see. This whole city bowed its head whenever he walked past. Anyone who dared betray him vanished without a trace. And yet, inside his own home, beneath the roof he had built with blood and power, a lie had been quietly growing for months without him ever knowing. And the first person to see it wasn't him. It was the quietest maid in the entire estate, the girl no one had ever bothered to notice. If this story touched you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that speaks to the heart like this one. That morning, before the hand of fate had time to push him back home, Ronan Castellano was sitting in a sealed room on the highest floor of a building he owned in downtown Chicago. There was nothing in the room except a long table, a few leather chairs, and a silence so heavy that a man could hear the ticking of his own wristwatch. Sitting across from him was a man named Calvin Reyes, someone who had worked under him for 3 years, someone who should have understood better than anyone the price of greed. Calvin sat there with both hands resting on his thighs, trying to keep his voice from trembling, but sweat had already begun to bead at his temples. Ronan was the opposite. He sat with his back straight, leaning into the chair, his cold gray eyes not blinking once, a cup of black coffee in his hand that he hadn't even bothered to sip. The story was very simple. Calvin had been assigned to oversee a sum of money collected from several small shops in the neighborhood under Ronan's organization's protection. Among them were an old woman who sold flowers and an immigrant family that had just opened a laundromat, the weakest people, the quietest people, the ones with the least power to speak for themselves. Calvin had forced them to pay twice the required amount, then slipped the difference into his own pocket, believing no one would care about a few stray dollars taken from such small, helpless lives. He was wrong. In Ronan's world, there was no such thing as no one noticing. Ronan set the coffee cup down on the table. The soft sound of porcelain touching wood was light, but it was enough to make Calvin flinch. He didn't shout, didn't slam his fist on the table, didn't raise his voice even once. He only asked, slowly and clearly, whether Calvin knew how old the woman who sold flowers was that year, whether he knew she was raising an orphaned grandchild one bouquet at a time. Calvin was silent. He didn't know. He had never bothered to ask. Ronan rose to his feet, walked around the table, and stopped behind him. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, he said, his voice still even, as if he were discussing the weather, that there were 2 kinds of people he never forgave in this world. The first was a man who betrayed the trust placed in him. The second was a strong man who used his strength to trample someone weaker. And Calvin, unfortunately, had committed both sins at once. The man in the chair began to beg. He promised he would pay it back, promised he would never do it again, promised everything he could think of. Ronan listened to all of it, patient as a father listening to a child tell a lie. Then he gave a signal to the 2 men who had been standing motionless in the corner of the room the whole time. They came forward, one on each side, and escorted Calvin out of the room. There was no loud sound. No terrible scene unfolded before anyone's eyes. There was only the door closing, and from that moment on, the name Calvin Reyes disappeared from every list, every conversation, every payroll in the organization, as though he had never existed at all. That was how Ronan punished. Quietly, decisively, and absolutely. When he was alone in the room, he walked to the great glass window and looked down at the city curling beneath the morning light. Below him, millions of people were living their lives without knowing that the streets they crossed, the shops they entered, all belonged to an invisible web with him at its center. Ronan Castellano was 34 years old. He had never allowed anyone to outmaneuver him, had never allowed a single debt to go unpaid. He had built an entire empire from nothing, with a cold mind and an iron rule that loyalty was the only thing in the world worth anything. The negotiation that had been expected to last the entire morning ended in less than an hour, because the other side agreed to every term faster than he had imagined. Ronan looked at his watch. It was still very early. An unexpected stretch of empty time opened before him, and for the first time in many weeks, he thought of going home in the middle of the day, sitting down to have a quiet lunch with the wife he still believed was the only decent thing left in his calculating life. He put on his coat and stepped into the elevator, completely unaware that the man who could always see through the lies of others was about to walk straight into the greatest lie of all, waiting for him beneath the roof of his own home, while Ronan sat high above the city, settling the debts of the underworld, almost an hour's drive away, inside the vast mansion hidden behind towering iron fences in the northern suburbs of Chicago. There was a young woman quietly doing her work, without a single person paying her any mind. Her name was Maid Sullivan. She was 27 years old, and she had worked as a maid in that house for more than a year. She was the kind of person you could pass 10 times in a single day and never truly see. A slender figure who always kept her head lowered, always moved close to the walls, always finished every task, before anyone had time to realize she had been there at all. The other servants in the house didn't like her, though she had never done anything to offend them. The head cook called her that quiet as a mouse girl in a voice thick with mockery, while the younger maids whispered behind her back with rumors that had no beginning and no end, saying she had once been involved in something shady, saying they had only hired her because she was willing to take the lowest wage and would never dare ask for anything. Maeve heard all of it. She always heard everything, but she never answered, never explained herself, only silently tightened her grip on the cleaning rag in her hand and turned away to continue her work, because she had learned long ago that for someone in her position, defending yourself wasn't only useless, it could sometimes make people suspect you even more. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, Maeve was the first person awake in the servants' quarters. She had one small habit no one knew about. Whenever she began a new day, she would open the bottom drawer of the old wooden dresser in her room, take out a tarnished silver pocket watch, press it against her palm for a long while, and only then put it away again. The watch no longer worked, and a thin crack ran across its glass face, but it was the only thing Maeve still had from her old life, the life before everything collapsed and pushed her here. She never told anyone about it, and no one had ever asked. In that mansion, there was an unwritten rule every servant knew by heart. No one was allowed to enter the private rooms of the master and mistress in the eastern wing unless they were called by name. It was the most private, most guarded territory in the house, a place where even the housekeeper had to knock and wait for permission. And yet the task of cleaning that area had been given to Maeve, not because she was trusted more than anyone else, but for a reason far more bitterly ironic. The mistress of the house, Adriana Castellano, had personally chosen her for the job, with a reason she stated plainly in front of everyone, saying this girl is closed-mouthed as a clam. She could see anything, and still wouldn't know how to breathe a word of it to anyone. So using her to clean the private rooms is safest. The sentence was spoken as an insult, and the other servants had smirked in agreement, but not one of them, not even Adriana herself, realized that they had just handed the girl they considered the most invisible person in the house the right to step into the place where the most secrets were hidden. Maeve accepted the work without a word, the way she had always accepted everything. That morning, with a small ring of keys in her hand and a stack of clean towels held against her chest, she quietly walked toward the eastern wing of the mansion, her feet familiar with every floor tile beneath her, completely unaware that in only a few minutes, the eyes that were so used to looking down would be forced to see something she would wish she had never seen at all. The door to the master and mistress's private bedroom closed behind Maeve with a soft sound, and she began her work in the familiar stillness. She drew back the curtains to let the morning light spill in, changed the bedsheets, wiped the dust from the polished tabletops, and did it all with the quiet skill of someone who had repeated those same movements hundreds of times. She wasn't curious about this room. She had never allowed herself to be curious, because she understood that curiosity was a luxury a person in her position wasn't allowed to have. But that morning, when she bent down to pick up a pillow that had fallen beside the armchair in the corner of the room, something came into view, half hidden beneath the chair, in a place no one would ever have seen unless they had happened to lower their head at exactly that angle. Maeve froze. She reached out and picked it up, and when the object rested in the hollow of her palm, her breath seemed to catch inside her chest. It was a gold cuff link, the kind of sleeve fastener wealthy men often wore, but it wasn't the master's. Maeve knew that better than anyone, because she was the one who arranged Mr. Ronan's wardrobe every week, the one who polished each pair of his cufflinks with her own hands and placed them back into their box in the proper order. This pair was completely unfamiliar, different in design, engraved with a strange initial she had never seen in this house. A man's belonging, inside the most private room of a married couple, while the husband was all the way in the heart of the city and certainly wasn't its owner. Maeve's hand began to tremble. She stood there, in the middle of a room flooded with sunlight, feeling as if the floor beneath her feet had tilted by the smallest degree. just enough to throw the whole world out of balance. In her mind, one thought collided with another. She understood at once what this object suggested. She wasn't so innocent that she didn't understand, but it was precisely because she understood that the fear inside her began to grow. She thought about speaking up, but to whom, and for what? If she went to the master and told him she had found a strange object in his wife's room, what would happen then? Would people believe a refined, beautiful woman, the master's lawful wife? Or would they believe the word of a poor maid with a stained past that everyone whispered about behind her back? Maeve had already tasted what it felt like to tell the truth and have the whole world turn away. She had once stood before powerful people and opened her mouth to defend herself, only to receive their contemptuous stares and a punishment for something she had never done. She knew too well that in this world, the truth didn't belong to the person who spoke it. It belonged to the person with enough power to decide who was right and who was wrong. And she had nothing at all, not a shred of power, not a protector behind her, not a single person who would stand on her side if everything came apart. She tightened her hand around the gold cufflink, the cold metal pressing against her skin, and for one long moment, she meant to put it back exactly where it had been beneath the chair, wipe away every trace, leave this room, and pretend she had never seen anything, the way she had always pretended not to hear the cruel words people threw at her. But something inside her wouldn't let her do that. A small and stubborn voice, the same voice that had once made her pay dearly in the past but had never been willing to die out completely. At last, after standing there in silence for a long while, Maeve didn't put the object back where she had found it. Nor did she take it away to accuse anyone. She quietly wrapped it in one corner of her handkerchief, hid it deep in her pocket, and continued finishing the room with hands that were still trembling, carrying inside her a secret she didn't yet know what to do with, a secret heavier than anything she had ever had to bear. Ronan's car rolled through the iron gates of the mansion close to noon, 3 hours earlier than usual, and it was precisely that unexpected early return that no one in the house had anticipated. He had come home for a very simple reason. The negotiation had ended sooner than expected, and for the first time in weeks buried under work, he wanted to spend a quiet lunch beside his wife, with no schedule, no telephone, and none of the calculating faces he had to confront every day. He entered the house through the front door, slipped off his coat and draped it over his arm, and from the very second he stepped across the threshold, something made him pause by the faintest beat. The house held a strange silence, not the ordinary silence he was used to, but the silence of a room where someone had just hurriedly put something away before he could see it. Adriana came down the staircase, and when she saw her husband standing there, an expression flickered across her face that another man would never have noticed. But Ronan wasn't another man. His whole life had been built on reading people, reading what hid behind a smile, behind a handshake, behind the sweetest voice. And in that brief instant, he saw something in his wife he had never seen before. Surprise. It lasted only a moment, and then she immediately gave him her familiar smile, came forward to embrace him, and asked why he was home so early without telling her first. Her voice was still gentle, still warm as always, but Ronan sensed something wrong. Her arms tightened around him a little too hard, a little too quickly, as if she were trying to keep him there in the entry hall instead of letting him move deeper into the house. Her eyes didn't stay entirely on his either. They kept slipping past his shoulder, toward the staircase that led to the eastern wing, then hurriedly pulling back again. Ronan returned his wife's embrace, placed a light kiss on her forehead, and in his calmest voice, asked whether anything had happened at home that morning. Adriana answered at once, a little faster than necessary, saying that someone from the family had stopped by to discuss a small matter and had already left. Just a minor piece of business, nothing worth troubling him over. Ronan nodded and said, "Is that so? Then let the conversation pass as though he believed her completely." But in his mind, a seed of suspicion had just been planted, because he knew every person in his family, knew who had the right to visit his home and who didn't, and according to the schedule he held in the palm of his hand, that morning there should have been no one with any reason to set foot here at all. He said nothing, didn't point out the contradiction, only quietly stored it in a corner of his cold mind. When he removed his shoes and stepped through the living room, his sharp eyes swept around the space out of habit and stopped for half a second on the low table in the middle of the room, where 2 glass tumblers sat side by side. One was untouched. One was half empty, and both bore traces of a strong liquor Adriana never drank. He saw it, then looked away as though nothing had happened. But inside him, The seed of suspicion that had just been planted silently pushed up another shoot. Adriana, standing behind him, was still saying something about lunch, about how she had told the kitchen to prepare his favorite dish, her voice chattering on so naturally that it was almost perfect. Almost, because while she was speaking, one sentence slipped out before she hurriedly swallowed it back, that it was a good thing he hadn't come home even earlier. And the moment those words left her lips, Ronan felt his whole body go faintly cold, though his face didn't change at all. That evening, husband and wife sat across from each other at the long dining table in the grand dining room, and to anyone looking in, it would have seemed like the picture of one of the happiest, most privileged couples in all of Chicago. Adriana had changed into another dress, redone her makeup, and sat there glowing as if nothing at all had happened that morning. She told Ronan about an upcoming art exhibition she wanted the two of them to attend together, about a friend who had just divorced and was suffering terribly, about a new dish she had learned to make, her voice flowing smoothly and gracefully, now and then breaking into a soft little laugh. Ronan ate in silence, nodding at the right moments, answering in the right places, smiling when a smile was required. He played his part perfectly, the role of a husband listening to his wife. But inside, he was doing something else entirely. He was watching her like a man studying a film whose ending he had already guessed, noticing every small gesture he had never bothered to care about before. He noticed the way she tilted her phone face down on the table every time a message lit up the screen, a movement so natural that it had clearly been repeated countless times. He noticed the way she smiled, a smile he now realized was too perfect, too precisely timed, as if it were something carefully practiced, instead of something born from real happiness. He noticed even the way she reached across the table and touched his hand, warm and familiar. But now, in his eyes, that touch seemed more like a habit of the body than one of the heart. What chilled Ronan wasn't suspicion itself, but the ease of it all, because a person couldn't perform that smoothly if she had only begun lying a few days ago. The calm on her face, the rhythm in every word, all of it showed that this wasn't the first time. It was the result of a long process, a lie polished over many months until it had become flawless. And it was precisely that flawlessness that accused her most clearly. The man who made this entire city hold its breath when he passed by. The man who could make a grown man tremble simply by setting a coffee cup down on a table. The man who had never let anyone get ahead of him in his entire life was sitting here, inside his own home, being brazenly deceived by the woman who slept in the same bed with him every night. And still he had to smile. One part of Ronan wanted to stand up right then, wanted to tear this whole performance apart, wanted to look straight into her eyes and ask her what she had done behind his back. But he didn't. He had lived too long in a world where the first man to let emotion overrun reason was the first man to lose. He understood that the moment he revealed he knew, all control would slip from his hands. She would have time to erase evidence, invent a story, prepare herself, and turn him from the betrayed man into the man falsely accusing his wife. So he chose silence, the sharpest weapon he had. He poured her more wine, asked her about the exhibition with what looked like sincere interest, and let the dinner pass peacefully like every other dinner before it. When she leaned over to kiss his cheek before leaving the table, Ronan remained seated there, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes following her shadow until it vanished beyond the doorway, and deep inside him, the seed of suspicion that had silently taken root now began to grow into something larger, colder, and far more resolute. Adriana wasn't a fool, and that was exactly what made her dangerous. A few days after that fateful afternoon, she began to feel that something was wrong inside her own house, a vague sense that someone was watching the things she did. She remembered the missing cufflink she had searched the whole room for and failed to find. She remembered that the only person allowed to clean that private section of the house was the quiet maid named Maeve. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became, and for a woman like Adriana, the way to deal with unease was never conversation. It was to remove the threat before it had the chance to speak. The next morning, while the whole house was busy preparing for a new day, Adriana summoned every servant to gather in the grand hall. She stood on the stairs, calm and dignified in appearance, holding an open jewelry box in her hand, then announced in a voice full of false anguish that a precious diamond bracelet of hers had vanished from her room. The entire hall fell silent. She let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, long enough to give it weight, then slowly turned her eyes toward Maeve, her gaze sharp as a blade, and said she didn't want to accuse anyone, but everyone knew very well that only one person in this house was allowed to enter that room. Every pair of eyes immediately turned toward her. Maeve stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, feeling the ground drop away beneath her feet once again. The very same feeling she had lived through in the past. The feeling of an entire room full of people aiming suspicious eyes at her when she had done nothing wrong. She stammered that she hadn't taken anything, that she had never touched the mistress's jewelry box, but her voice grew smaller and weaker beneath the whispers beginning to rise around her. The head cook shook her head as if disappointed, while the younger maids murmured to one another that they had known from the beginning there was something wrong with that girl, that her shady past had finally shown itself. Not one person stepped forward to defend her. Not one person asked her whether it was true. In the small world of that mansion, the mistress's word was truth, and the word of a poor maid wasn't worth more than a speck of dust. Adriana ordered the housekeeper to search Maeve's room at once, and while everyone moved off together, she remained standing there with the face of a betrayed victim, calculating quietly that as long as she could force this girl out of the house under the name of a thief, then no matter what the girl might say later, no one would believe her anymore. Maeve was led back to her own room, and stood watching as they pulled open every drawer, searched every corner of the wardrobe, and threw her few belongings onto the floor. She didn't resist, didn't scream or cry, only stood there with both hands clenched tight, and eyes so dry they were frightening, because tears were something she had run out of long ago. But when a hand reached toward the bottom drawer of the old wooden dresser, the place where the most precious object of her life was hidden, she cried out in a plea for the first time, her voice breaking as she begged them not to touch it, begged them to give it back to her. That unusual reaction only made everyone more certain she was hiding the stolen evidence, and they yanked the drawer open. Inside, there was only a tarnished silver pocket watch, not a diamond bracelet, not anything valuable at all. The housekeeper picked it up to examine it, then tossed it back with contempt, and Maeve hurriedly snatched it into her hands, clutching it tightly against her chest, as if she were holding the last remaining fragment of a life already lost. She collapsed to her knees amid the belongings that had been turned upside down, the young woman the entire house had turned against, carrying on her shoulders an accusation she had never committed, alone and helpless, in exactly the same way she had once been alone and helpless, many years before. Just as the housekeeper was about to declare that the maid would be thrown out of the house that very day, a deep, cold voice sounded from the end of the hallway, making everyone fall instantly silent. Ronan had been standing there for who knew how long, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe, both hands in his pockets, his gray eyes sweeping over the chaos before him with a calm so eerie it sent a chill through the room. The entire room seemed to freeze. Adriana, who had held the upper hand only a moment before, suddenly went still, and for the first time that morning, the confident smile on her face wavered faintly. Ronan slowly stepped inside, each footstep sounding in the absolute stillness, then stopped and looked at the belongings scattered across the floor, looked at the young woman kneeling among them, clutching a small object tightly in her hands. In a voice that wasn't loud but was clear enough for everyone to hear every word, he asked what was happening in his house. Adriana hurried to speak first, recounting in a voice full of outrage that her diamond bracelet had been stolen, that only this maid had access to the private room, that every piece of evidence pointed to one person. Ronan listened until she had finished, not interrupting, his face revealing nothing at all. Then he turned to look at Maeve, and with one brief question, he asked whether she had taken the bracelet. Maeve lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but her gaze honest, and answered that she hadn't taken it, that she swore on everything she had left in this world that she had never touched it. Ronan looked at her for a long while, so long that the air in the room seemed to thicken. He wasn't a man who easily believed anyone. In his life, he had seen too many people lie with the most sincere faces, had learned that tears and oaths were the cheapest things in the world he lived in. He didn't immediately believe this girl, and he had no reason to believe a servant whose face he had barely even remembered before. But something made his seasoned instinct speak, and that something wasn't in the maid. It was in his own wife. He noticed that Adriana was talking too much, pushing too hard, forcing the matter forward with unusual speed, as if she didn't want anyone to have time to ask questions. He remembered that afternoon when she had startled at seeing him come home early. He remembered the sentence she had let slip before hurriedly swallowing it back. He remembered the 2 strange glasses of liquor on the table. And now, just as he had begun to suspect that something murky was happening inside his own home, the only person allowed to enter that locked room had suddenly been accused and was about to be rushed out so quickly. The coincidence was too neat, too perfectly timed, and Ronan had never believed in neat coincidences. He straightened, and in a firm voice that allowed no one to argue, he ordered everything to stop at once. He said no one would be thrown out of this house without clear proof that a missing bracelet wasn't enough to destroy a person's life, and that from this moment on, every decision concerning the servants in this house would go through him. Adriana was stunned. She tried to recover, asking whether he truly believed the word of a maid over his own wife, but Ronan only looked at her with a flat, unreadable gaze and answered that he didn't believe anyone. He simply didn't like having answers arranged for him in advance. Those words drained the color from Adriana's face, because she understood they weren't only about the maid. Maeve remained kneeling there, looking up at the powerful man who had just stopped the sentence against her, her heart tangled with a feeling she couldn't name, half bewilderment and half confusion, because she knew he hadn't defended her. And yet in the end, she had still been allowed to stay, though even she didn't understand why. That night, after everyone had dispersed and the house had sunk into silence, Maeve sat alone in her small room, holding the silver pocket watch in the hollow of her palm, and for the first time in a very long while, she allowed the old memories to come flooding back. 3 years ago, her life had been something entirely different. She had once had a decent home, a steady accounting job at a small transportation company in the suburbs, and a husband named Daniel whom she loved with all her heart. They weren't rich, but they were happy. And that pocket watch had been Daniel's wedding gift to her. The thing he said would remind her that no matter how time passed, he would always be beside her. But then everything collapsed in a single night. The company where she worked turned out to have been used by some hidden underworld force to launder dirty money through its books. And when everything came to light, when the police stormed in and the truly powerful people behind it all quietly withdrew into the shadows, someone was needed to carry the blame. And that someone was Maeve, the lowly accountant whose name appeared on every document she had signed, without ever knowing the truth behind them. She had tried to explain. She had stood before one person after another and sworn that she was innocent, that she had only done her job and hadn't known anything about that dirty money. But no one believed her. The people who were truly guilty had enough money and enough power to bend the truth, to turn her from a victim into the mastermind in everyone's eyes. She lost her job, lost her honor, and more painful than anything else. During those terrible months, Daniel fell ill and passed away, partly from the shock, partly from the silent threats the two of them had endured from the forces that wanted to keep them quiet forever. Maeve was left alone in the ashes of her own life, carrying the name of someone untrustworthy, a label that made people turn away from her wherever she went. She couldn't get any decent work anymore, because all anyone had to do was look up the name Maeve Sullivan, and half-true, half-false reports about a money laundering case, in which she had been cast as the central figure, would immediately appear. She fell to the very bottom of society, doing every kind of physical labor she could just to survive each day. Until at last she found shelter in the Castellano mansion, where people hired her because she would accept a miserable wage and would never dare ask questions. It was because of that past that now, with evidence of the mistress's betrayal in her hands, Maeve was so torn apart. She longed to speak the truth. She longed, just once, for someone to believe her, because she understood better than anyone the pain of carrying the truth inside your heart while no one was willing to listen. But at the same time, she was numb with fear, because she had paid too dearly before for daring to open her mouth, had once lost everything, simply because she believed the truth would protect her. She tightened her grip on the watch, feeling the familiar coldness of the metal, and in the darkness of that small room, she wondered whether this time would be different, whether the man who had stopped the sentence against her that morning might be the first person willing to believe her, or whether he would become like all the others, turning his back the moment the truth became inconvenient. She had no answer. All she knew was that the secret she was carrying was too large to keep buried inside forever, and too dangerous to speak aloud. While Maeve tossed and turned with her secret, somewhere else in the mansion, Ronan wasn't sleeping either. He sat alone in his private study on the ground floor, a place even Adriana wasn't allowed to enter once the door was closed, and began doing the thing he was better at than anything else in the world, turning scattered fragments of suspicion into a complete picture. He didn't need to hire anyone from the outside, didn't need to seek out strangers to pry into his own private affairs, because he had something in his hands that ordinary money couldn't buy, a network of loyal people spread across the city, eyes and ears always ready to work the moment he gave the word. He picked up the phone and called the only man he truly trusted inside the organization, his right hand named Silvio, the man who had stood beside him since the first days of building his empire. He didn't explain at length, didn't reveal any emotion, only gave a brief order that he wanted to know every movement his wife had made over the past 6 months, every place she had gone, every person she had met, every call and message she thought no one knew about. He wanted to know who that strange cufflink belonged to, and he wanted to know who had set foot inside his house while he was away. Silvio didn't ask a single question, didn't show surprise, only answered with one short yes, because in their world, when Ronan Castellano gave an order, people simply carried it out, and the machine began to move. Within only a few days, Ronan's invisible people were quietly working all across Chicago, following every trace Adriana had left behind without ever realizing it. They reviewed footage from street cameras, traced the history of her credit cards, questioned hotel employees, doormen, men who were used to keeping silent but would open their mouths when the right person asked. One small piece of information after another began to flow back to Ronan's desk, and he sat there night after night, coldly fitting them together. He discovered that on the afternoons, when Adriana told him she was meeting friends or attending charity events, she had in fact gone to a luxury apartment building downtown, a place she had no legitimate reason to visit. He discovered that those visits hadn't happened just once or twice, but had been repeated regularly for many months. And when his people found the owner of the strange cufflink, matching its design and the initial engraved on it with the city's business connections, every doubt inside Ronan began to settle into one cold truth. The notable thing was that in everything his people gathered, not a single detail contradicted what the maid had accidentally seen. The strange object in the private room, the man who had visited the house while he was away, Adriana's panic when he came home early, all of it fit together like pieces from the same picture. Ronan sat in silence before the documents spread across his desk, and for the first time, he thought of the maid with a different kind of attention. He still didn't trust her completely, still kept his natural caution inside him, but he couldn't deny that everything the girl had said matched the truth he had dug up with his own hands. He realized that on the night she had been falsely accused, the girl had more than enough chances to invent a story, to shift blame, to buy his sympathy by accusing the mistress of the house, but she hadn't done that. She had only quietly sworn that she was innocent, and nothing more. And that very silence, in the eyes of a man far too familiar with talkative liars, was what made him begin to think again about the young woman he had regarded as invisible until now. But the truth Ronan was about to uncover was larger and colder than anything he had ever imagined. A few days later, Silvio came to see him with a new stack of documents, and this time, the usually composed face of his right-hand man carried an unusual heaviness. He placed several long-distance photographs on the desk in front of Ronan, and when Ronan looked at the man appearing beside his wife in those pictures, his entire body seemed to turn to stone. That man wasn't some nameless lover. He wasn't a young man Adriana had gone to in order to fill the emptiness of boredom. It was Tobias Vance, Ronan's most dangerous rival for many years, an ambitious up-and-coming crime boss who had been quietly trying to swallow piece after piece of the territory Ronan had poured so much effort into building. These two men were sworn enemies in the underworld, and now one of them was sleeping with the other man's wife. But that still wasn't the worst of it. When Silvio turned over the remaining pages of the file, Ronan realized this wasn't simply a betrayal in marriage. The secret meetings between Adriana and Tobias weren't only about desire, they were exchanges of information. For months, Adriana had been secretly feeding Tobias her husband's business secrets, his plans, his upcoming deals, the weak points in Ronan's network that only someone in the closest position to him could have known. It was because of that information that Tobias had kept staying one step ahead of Ronan all this time, taking contracts that should have belonged to him, slipping into territories Ronan should have controlled. The woman who slept in the same bed with him every night, the woman he had still believed was the last decent thing left in his life, had turned out to be the dagger buried deepest in his back. Ronan sat in silence for a very long time before those documents, and in that silence, he slowly began to understand his wife's true motive. Adriana hadn't betrayed him only because of some blind love for another man. She had betrayed him for something far colder and far more calculated. She was sick of living as the wife of a mafia boss, sick of always living in fear, behind high walls and unspoken rules, sick of standing behind a man whose power would never belong to her. Tobias had promised her a way out, not a way out that meant running away, but a way out that meant rising higher. He had painted for her a vision of the day Ronan would fall, the day his empire would crumble beneath the attacks she herself was helping carry out. And when that day came, She would no longer be the shadow standing behind a fading man. She would become the powerful woman beside the victor. She had wagered her whole life on that gamble, wagered that Tobias would win, that she had chosen the right side in the war to come. When Ronan understood all of that, he didn't explode into rage the way people might imagine a betrayed man would. On the contrary, he became calmer, colder, more clear-headed than ever before, because now he understood that this was no longer just a war to preserve a husband's pride. It was a life-and-death war to protect everything he had built, and more importantly, to protect the people under his command, the ones who had placed their lives and loyalty in his hands, without ever knowing that the greatest danger came from inside their own leader's home. He closed the file, his gray eyes shining with something cold and razor-sharp, and in that moment, he was no longer a wounded husband. He had returned to being the man all of Chicago feared. Along with uncovering the truth about Adriana and Tobias, Ronan also had his people quietly verify the entire story of the missing diamond bracelet, and the result didn't surprise him. His men found the bracelet carefully hidden in another drawer inside Adriana's own room. It hadn't been stolen, hadn't been misplaced, but had simply been concealed in order to stage a perfect performance. Everything was now clear as daylight. Adriana had deliberately framed the maid, not because anything had truly been lost, but because she had realized the girl might have seen something, and she wanted to remove the only witness before everything came apart. That evening, Ronan summoned Maeve to his study. She entered with her familiar, cautious manner, her hands clasped together, her eyes lowered to the floor, bracing herself for the worst, because in all her life's experience, a private summons from a powerful person had never brought anything good. She stood there waiting, secretly thinking that perhaps they had finally decided to send her away after all, that the mercy shown that morning had only been temporary. But Ronan didn't say the thing she feared. He sat behind his desk, looked at her for a while, then said in a low and steady voice that he knew she hadn't taken the bracelet. Maeve's head snapped up, her eyes widening in astonishment. He went on to say that he had ordered it checked and had found it, that the entire accusation against her had been staged, and that she had done nothing wrong. For one moment, the whole room seemed to stop, and Maeve stood there without being able to speak. It had been 3 years, 3 long years since the day her life had collapsed, and not once had she heard words like that from another human being's mouth. 3 years of living with the name of someone untrustworthy. 3 years of opening her mouth to tell the truth, only to have everyone turn away. 3 years of learning to be silent, because she understood that no one cared to listen to someone in her position. And yet now, the most powerful man she had ever met, the man the whole city feared, was sitting before her and telling her that he believed her. Not because she had begged, not because she had cried and pleaded for pity, but because he had found the truth himself, and the truth stood on her side. The feeling was so great that Maeve couldn't hold it back anymore. Her shoulders began to tremble, and the tears she had thought had dried up long ago suddenly spilled over, rolling down her face. She hurriedly lifted a hand to wipe them away, ashamed of her weakness in front of her employer, stammering an apology, but she couldn't make herself stop. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of something she hadn't felt in far too long. It was the feeling that at last, someone in this world had seen her as a human being, not as an invisible shadow or a sinner. Ronan watched her cry, and he said nothing more, didn't rush to comfort her, didn't show irritation either. He only quietly pushed a clean handkerchief on the desk toward her, a small and simple action. But to Maeve in that moment, it carried more weight than 1,000 words of comfort. She took the handkerchief with trembling hands, and in that silent room, for the first time in 3 years, the young woman who had once been rejected by the whole world felt a small piece of the dignity she thought she had lost forever being returned to her. Ronan had no idea that with only one sentence and one small gesture, he had just touched the deepest part of a soul that had endured too much pain, and planted there something Maeve had not dared to have in a very long time: hope. In the days that followed, Ronan continued having his people dig deeper into Tobias Vance's organization, not only to understand how strong his enemy truly was, but also to find every weakness that could be used to bring him down. Silvio and Ronan's people traced every name in Tobias's network, every front company, every foot soldier and business partner this rising boss used to launder money and expand his power, and it was in the middle of that search that one unexpected name appeared, making Ronan stop cold. It was the name of a small transportation company that had once been used as a tool for laundering money many years earlier, a case that had been exposed and then closed with an unknown woman being made to bear all the blame. When Ronan read the woman's name in the file, he recognized it at once. It was the maid working inside his own house, Maeve Sullivan. He sat in silence for a while, then ordered his people to dig even deeper into that old case. And what they uncovered slowly revealed a picture that had been hidden for far too long. The transportation company where Maeve had once worked hadn't become a place for washing dirty money by chance. It had been one link in a much larger network. And the man behind the exploitation of that company, the man who had quietly directed the flow of money through the books Maeve had unknowingly signed, was one of the trusted men who had followed Tobias Vance from the very beginning. That man was now an important link in Tobias's empire. Someone who had climbed upward from those filthy old operations that he and his accomplices had covered up without hesitation by pushing an innocent accountant forward to carry all the guilt. Ronan understood at once that this wasn't some arrangement of fate, not some strange coincidence of the universe. It was simply the consequence of a cold truth, that the underworld was always a closed circle, a place where wicked men eventually became tied to one another in one way or another. The man who had destroyed Maeve's life years ago and the man betraying Ronan today turned out to belong to the same machine, both serving the same ambition. When he realized that, something inside Ronan changed. His war with Tobias had always been a matter of power between two underworld forces, a cold war with no room for emotion. But now it carried a new meaning, one he himself hadn't expected. Bringing down Tobias and the men beneath him was no longer only about protecting his territory and punishing the one who had betrayed him. It was also about reopening an unjust sentence that had weighed on one human being for years. Ronan sat in the quiet of his study, thinking of the maid who had cried in front of him because, for the first time, someone had believed her, and he suddenly understood that the silent pain she had carried for so long wasn't some separate story. It was tied by a straight thread to the very enemy he was hunting. He didn't tell Maeve what he had discovered, at least not yet, because he understood that some truths had to be given at the proper moment. But inside him, a decision had already been made. When he struck Tobias, he wouldn't only take back what belonged to him, he would drag into the light the old sins that had been buried, and the innocent people who had been crushed beneath the heels of greedy men. And for the first time in a war that had once been purely about power, Ronan Castellano realized he was fighting not only for himself, but for someone else. Late one evening, after the entire mansion had sunk into sleep, Ronan stepped out into the garden behind the house to breathe in a little cold air and arrange the calculations in his mind, when he came upon Maeve sitting alone on the stone steps, holding the familiar silver pocket watch in her hand. She didn't hear his footsteps, and in that moment when she had no idea she was being watched, she revealed a face entirely different from her usual caution, a face marked by deep sorrow, but also full of quiet resilience, the face of someone who had grown used to holding her pain alone in the dark. Ronan stood still for a while, then instead of leaving, he slowly walked over and sat down a short distance from her on the steps. Maeve startled and moved as if to stand, by the instinct of a servant before her master. But he gave a slight gesture telling her to remain seated. Two people from two completely different worlds sat there in the silence of the night, neither of them speaking for a long time. Then Ronan, in a voice lower than usual, asked her if that watch must mean a great deal to her. Maeve tightened her hand gently around it, and after a moment of hesitation, she answered that it was the only thing left from someone she had once loved, someone who was gone. She didn't say anything more, and Ronan didn't ask anything more, because he understood that some wounds didn't need to be laid bare for another person to feel them. He looked at her, this young woman whom the whole world had trampled on, yet who had still not lost the honesty within her soul, the woman who had been pushed to the very bottom and still held on to a kind of dignity that even the richest and most powerful people he had ever met didn't possess. And for the first time, he saw in her not a nameless servant, but a human being with a depth he had never bothered to notice before. As for Maeve, she too was looking at the man beside her with different eyes. She had grown used to thinking of Ronan the way everyone else did, as a cold and powerful man whom everyone feared, a man built from steel and darkness. But now, sitting beside him in the quiet night, she caught a glimpse of something else hidden beneath that armor, the loneliness of a man who had also just been betrayed by the person he trusted most, a weariness that power couldn't completely conceal. She realized that beneath that frightening name, he too was only a human being carrying wounds of his own. In that brief moment, a silent understanding began to grow between them. Not love, not yet love, but something more delicate, more fragile, like a seedling quietly pushing up between two souls that had both tasted betrayal and loss. Ronan was the first to stand. He said softly that it was late, and she should go inside and rest. Maeve nodded, and when he turned to walk away, she quietly called after him and thanked him. Not for anything specific, but for everything. Ronan stopped for one beat, not turning around, only answering softly that she didn't need to thank him for telling the truth. Then he stepped back inside, leaving Maeve sitting alone beneath the moonlight, her heart warmed by a strange feeling she hadn't known in a very long time, the feeling that perhaps, only perhaps, there was still a place in this world for someone like her. Ronan wasn't a man who struck while anger was still hot in his blood, and that was why he always won. Instead of immediately exposing his wife or rushing into a direct confrontation with Tobias, he decided to do what he did best, to turn that very betrayal into a trap that would destroy both enemies at once. He began by creating a false piece of information, so refined and so tempting that no greedy man could resist it. He let it spread inside the organization that he was about to carry out a massive deal, a secret transfer of assets worth many millions of dollars at a warehouse in the southern port district of the city, on one specific night, with very few guards accompanying him. It was the kind of information that, if it reached Tobias, the man wouldn't be able to ignore the chance to strike, because ambushing that deal would mean delivering a fatal blow to Ronan and seizing an enormous fortune. The subtlety lay in the fact that Ronan didn't release this information to everyone. He revealed it deliberately to only a very small number of trusted people, giving each person a version with slightly different details, such as the specific night, the exact warehouse location, and the number of men going along. It was a two-layer trap. The first layer was that if the information leaked to Tobias, the content of that information would point directly to the person who had passed it along, because each version had been given to only one person. The second layer was that once Tobias took the bait and led his men to that warehouse, he wouldn't be rushing into the rich opportunity he imagined, but straight into a trap Ronan had already laid in advance. And to make certain the information would reach his wife's ears, Ronan carefully arranged for Adriana herself to hear the version meant for her. One evening, he pretended to speak on the phone with Silvio right inside the bedroom, letting his voice carry loudly enough as he discussed that secret deal with carefully planted details, all while pretending he had no idea Adriana was standing outside the door listening to every word. He watched her over the following days with the patience of a hunter, and sure enough, within only a few days, his people reported back that Adriana had held a secret meeting with one of Tobias's men, and that the version of the information Tobias was now urgently preparing to ambush was exactly the version Ronan had deliberately let his wife hear. The trap had closed. Ronan now had the final, undeniable proof in his hands that Adriana was the informant, and at the same time, he had lured Tobias into stepping directly into the snare he wanted. He sat in his study, silently laying out every step for the fateful night to come, placing his men in each position, calculating every move like a chess player controlling a board, before his opponent had even realized he had lost before the match began. Not one threat was spoken. Not one sign was allowed to show on the outside. During those days, he still treated Adriana exactly as usual, still ate dinner with her, still answered her false, cheerful chatter with a calm smile, so much so that she fully believed her plan was unfolding smoothly, that she was about to witness the collapse of the husband she had wagered would fail. She didn't know that every smile she received in those days was the smile of a man who already held victory firmly in his hands, that the man she believed was being led to the edge of ruin was in fact the very one quietly digging the pit for her and her accomplices to fall into together. Ronan Castellano had never held the upper hand more completely than he did now, and those who had betrayed him were still intoxicated by the illusion of their own triumph. But Tobias Vance hadn't climbed to his position by being stupid, and that was something Ronan had almost forgotten. Just 2 days before the fateful night at the Port District warehouse, everything suddenly slipped off the course Ronan had calculated. Tobias, who was every bit as suspicious as his opponent, had begun to feel that something about the deal he had heard was too perfect, too easy. A massive fortune being transferred with too few guards, an opportunity arriving at exactly the right moment. All of it made the rising boss's survival instinct ring out in warning. Instead of rushing into the trap the way Ronan expected, Tobias decided to test his opponent again with a ruthless and unexpected move. He didn't go to the warehouse. Instead, he sent his men to attack one of Ronan's real business operations on the west side of the city, a restaurant that served as a cover for part of the organization's activities. a place where Ronan's loyal people were working. The news crashed in during the night and jolted Ronan out of his confidence. His men reported that the place was under threat, that Tobias's people had stormed in and were holding everyone there under control, including Silvio, the right-hand man Ronan trusted most, who happened to be there that night. This was Tobias's poisonous move. He wanted to use those people as hostages to force Ronan to show himself, to reverse the board and turn the hunter into prey. In that moment, Ronan realized that his perfect trap had been scented out by his opponent, and now the people loyal to him were paying the price. A chill ran down his spine, not fear for himself, but the thing he hated most in the world unfolding before his eyes. Powerful men trampling the people under his command, people who had placed their loyalty and their lives in his hands. The situation had become extremely dangerous. If he acted rashly, the people in Tobias's hands could be harmed. If he hesitated, he would lose not only a business operation, but the loyalty of an entire organization built on the belief that their leader would never abandon them. Adriana, watching from a distance through the information she received, felt for the first time that the game was turning in her favor. She believed Tobias had moved one step ahead of Ronan, that her proud husband had finally been driven into a corner. She didn't know that this cruel threat had awakened in Ronan something even more dangerous than strategy. The cold fury of a man willing to do anything to protect the people who belonged to him. Ronan rose in the middle of the night, called together his most elite forces, and within a few brief minutes, threw aside his original, intricate plan to build a new move on the spot. He understood that Tobias was expecting him to rush in to save his people in panic, waiting for him to make the mistake of a man under pressure. And he decided he wouldn't give him that. He would go, but not as desperate prey. He would go as the very man all of Chicago feared. As he prepared to step into the most dangerous battle of his life, there was one thing he hadn't had time to foresee, one piece on the board that both he and Tobias had overlooked: the quiet maid inside the mansion, the woman who was about to be pulled into the eye of the storm in a way no one expected. While Ronan was gathering his forces to deal with Tobias's attack, Adriana was carrying out her own final move, and that move was aimed straight at the person she still considered the quietest threat inside the house. Adriana had never forgotten that the silent maid might have seen something, and that it was because of that girl that her plan to frame her had failed, causing her husband to begin suspecting her. Now, with everything moving toward its decisive moment, she couldn't allow such a dangerous witness to remain within Ronan's reach. Taking advantage of the chaos spreading through the mansion because of the crisis at the West Side operation, Adriana secretly allowed two of Tobias's men to slip into the servants' quarters and ordered them to take Maeve away to some deserted place so the matter could be ended quietly. Maeve was caught while she was alone in the back kitchen late that night. The two men appeared like shadows, blocking her way out, and at once she understood that she was in real danger. She stepped back, her heart pounding wildly, trying to keep her voice calm as she asked who they were and what they wanted. But the men only moved toward her with cold, threatening faces. In low, menacing voices, they told her she had seen things she shouldn't have seen, that there were powerful people who wanted her to disappear from this story without making a sound. Maeve felt a familiar fear rise in her chest, the same fear she had known years before when invisible forces had threatened her life. But this time, it was far more direct and far more terrifying. They forced her into the corner of the kitchen, building a wall of intimidation around her, speaking chilling warnings about what would happen if she dared open her mouth about anything. Maeve didn't scream or beg, though inside she was trembling. Years of living at the bottom had taught her that panic only made things worse, so she tried to keep her mind clear, her eyes darting quickly in search of a way out. She tried to back toward the rear door that led out to the garden, saying as she moved that she didn't know anything, that she was only a hired servant and had nothing to do with the affairs of important people. But the two men weren't shaken, and when one of them stepped forward and grabbed her arm to drag her away, Maeve used every bit of strength she had to wrench herself free, knocking over a rack of pots and pans, and sending sharp, violent noise crashing through the kitchen. That chaos bought her a few precious seconds. She bolted toward the door and ran out into the dark garden, her heart pounding as if it might burst, while the two men chased close behind her. In the darkness of the vast garden, the small young woman ran with everything she had, stumbling, forcing herself back up, hiding behind rows of trees, trying to stretch every second long enough to find a way to escape. It was during those life-and-death moments that another servant in the mansion, who happened to witness the scene from a window, frantically found a way to send word outside And the news that the maid was being chased through the garden by strangers quickly reached Ronan just as he was preparing to leave. When that news reached his ears, something inside Ronan changed completely. Until that moment, his war had still been a matter of power and strategy, a chessboard that had to be solved with a cold mind. But the instant he heard that the innocent young woman, the one who had placed her fragile trust in him, was being hunted like prey inside his own home, all the cold calculations inside him gave way to something far more primal and far more fierce. He was no longer only a man going to demand justice for himself. Now, he was charging forward to protect a human being. Ronan arrived at the exact decisive moment. He rushed straight to the garden with a furious speed, his men close behind him, and when he stepped into the dark grounds, he found the sight of two men cornering Maeve against the far wall of the grounds, where she had no path left to run. His arrival was like a storm descending without warning. Tobias's two men had not even had time to understand what was happening before Ronan's people subdued them swiftly. And Ronan himself, with all the cold strength of a man protecting what belonged to him, stopped them in the blink of an eye. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to act with brutality. His presence and authority alone were enough to make those two men understand that they had just made the greatest mistake of their lives. Maeve stood pressed against the wall, trembling, and when she realized who had just saved her, she nearly collapsed with relief. Ronan stepped toward her, and in that moment, the man the entire city feared for his ruthlessness suddenly became someone entirely different. He took off his coat and draped it over the shoulders of the shivering young woman, asking if she was all right in a voice gentler than anything she had ever heard from him. That protection, coming from the very man who was used to ordering punishment, made an emotion rise inside Maeve that she couldn't name. But that night was not yet over. Ronan had his men take Maeve somewhere safe, then turned back to finish the unfinished game with Tobias. He understood that the attack on the West Side operation and the men sent to hunt down the Maid were both moves made by the same enemy, and now it was time for him to close it all. Through his network, he quickly lifted the threat around the seized location, rescued Silvio and the loyal people being held there, and reversed the board that Tobias had believed was already firmly in his hands. Then he went to Tobias himself. The final confrontation between the two bosses did not unfold as the bloody chaos people often imagined of the underworld, but as the absolute domination of a man who had calculated every move in advance. When Tobias realized that Ronan had seen through his entire plan from the beginning, that the people he trusted had been bought off or neutralized, that he had stepped into a trap far larger than the one he thought he had avoided, the arrogance on his face collapsed completely. Ronan stood before his enemy without needing a weapon, without needing to raise his voice, and with only his cold eyes and slow words, he made Tobias understand that the game was over, that everything he had built through betrayal and dirty money would now turn to ash. Tobias was escorted away by Ronan's men, and just like the way so many traitors before him had disappeared, that ambitious rising boss was stripped of all power, all influence, and pushed out of the game quietly and absolutely. But the final blow, the coldest blow, Ronan reserved for his wife. He returned to the mansion when the sky was nearly dawn, and Adriana, still waiting for news of Tobias's victory, the victory she was certain would come, froze in shock when she saw her husband walk in with the bearing of a man who had just won completely. Ronan didn't scold her, didn't smash anything, didn't give her the angry performance for which she might have already prepared her answers. He only placed on the table before her all the evidence he had collected, every photograph, every document, every trace of betrayal in both their marriage and his business, and let the silence say everything. Adriana's face lost color little by little as she realized that every move she had made had been seen through, that the man she had thought was being pushed toward the edge had in fact never once lost the upper hand, that she had wagered her entire life on the losing side. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but there was no longer a single word that could save anything. The game was over, and she had lost everything. In the days after that fateful night, Ronan quietly carried out justice in his own way, not through courts or the law, but through the very power he had spent his entire life building. Tobias Vance, the man who had once fed the ambition of swallowing Ronan's entire empire, now collapsed completely. Ronan didn't need to do anything brutal with his own hands, because he understood that in the underworld, nothing destroyed a man faster than making his own side turn its back on him. He released proof of Tobias's weakness and mistakes to the very people who had once placed their faith in him, and in only a short time, those who had once obeyed Tobias left him one after another, because in the world they lived in, people were loyal only to the strong and Tobias was no longer strong. The empire he had worked so hard to build through betrayal broke apart piece by piece, until the name Tobias Vance no longer made anyone care, and a man who had once been full of power became a faint shadow forgotten by the very people who had once knelt before him. But the most important thing in that purge was not Tobias's collapse, but what was brought into the light along with it. When Ronan had his people tear apart Tobias's entire filthy business network, he also dragged into the open old crimes that had been buried for years, including the truth about the money laundering case from long ago, the case that had pushed an innocent accountant down to the very bottom of life. With his power and his connections, Ronan made sure that the truth was not known only to him, but was delivered to the right places, where it was officially acknowledged. The name Maeve Sullivan, the name that had been tied to shame and slander for 3 long years, was finally cleansed. The people who had truly committed the crime were exposed, and the young woman who had carried an unjust sentence in their place was given back the innocence she should never have lost. For Maeve, it was something she hadn't dared dream of during all those dark years, the moment when the world finally admitted that she was innocent, that she had never been the bad person they had made her out to be. As for Adriana, the punishment meant for her took on a different shape, quiet but no less merciless. Ronan didn't treat her with the cruelty he used against enemies in the underworld, because after all, she had once been someone he loved, but he also gave her no way out. He exposed her betrayal before the entire family, and in a world where honor and loyalty were everything, a woman who had betrayed her husband and helped his enemy no longer had any place to stand. Adriana was stripped of every privilege, every position she had gained through that marriage, and driven out of the world of power she had once longed to seize for herself. The woman who had once walked proudly with the confidence of a queen now lost everything, not only because she had chosen the wrong side in her gamble, but because she had traded away the most precious things, trust and decency, in pursuit of an empty ambition. She left the mansion alone, with no one to see her off, walking toward a lonely future she had woven with her own hands. Ronan stood watching her figure fade from sight, and inside him there was no gloating satisfaction of a victor. There was only a quiet sorrow for a love that had once been real, but had been strangled to death by her own hands, and a deep understanding that every betrayal eventually leads the one who commits it toward their own ruin. He had carried out justice, not with hatred, but with the cold fairness of a man who understood the price of loyalty and lies better than anyone. That winter passed, and when the first warm days of spring returned to Chicago, the Castellano mansion had taken on an entirely different atmosphere, lighter, truer, as though the house itself had finally shed an invisible burden that had pressed down on it for so many long months. Ronan was still the powerful man the whole city knew, but something in him had changed since that fateful night. For so many years, he had lived by the fear he planted in others, had measured every person around him by the scale of usefulness and betrayal, had believed that in the world he lived in, kindness and honesty were luxuries reserved for the weak. But that quiet young woman, the one who had nothing in her hands except her self-respect and her integrity, had taught him something all his power and money had never been able to teach, that in a world filled with people willing to sell one another out for gain, there were still those who chose to live decently even when that decency could cost them dearly. Maeve was no longer the invisible maid. Ronan had returned to her not only her innocence, but also her dignity and her right to live like a true human being. She was free to choose her own path, invited to stay not as a servant, but as someone he sincerely respected. One afternoon, when the spring sunlight spread gold across the garden where that terrifying night had once unfolded, Ronan found Maeve standing quietly, watching the first shoots push up from the earth. He stepped to her side, and for a long while, the two of them simply stood there in silence, like two people who had gone through too many storms and had now found a quiet place of peace together. Then Ronan, in a low and unusually sincere voice, told her that she didn't owe him anything, that she was completely free to begin again anywhere she wanted. Maeve turned to look at him, and after a moment, she softly answered that perhaps she didn't want to go anywhere at all, that this was the first place in many years where she felt she was seen as a human being. Ronan said nothing more, only gave a slight nod, and across his usually cold face there passed a gentle light he himself had perhaps forgotten long ago. No confession of love was spoken, no hurried handclasp was made, only two wounded people standing side by side beneath the spring sun, allowing a newly budding feeling to find its own way, slowly and steadily, like the shoots rising from the cold earth. Their story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that true power doesn't lie in the ability to make others afraid, but in knowing how to recognize and cherish honesty, in knowing how to protect the vulnerable and return justice to those who have been trampled on, that no matter how deeply life has crushed a person, as long as they keep integrity in their heart, there will finally come a day when the truth speaks and dignity is reborn. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more heart-touching stories like this one. We would love to know how you felt about the story you just heard, so please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because every comment you write is a precious source of encouragement that helps us continue bringing you more meaningful stories each day. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.